Now that we are done with the basic blocks, let's make the items. This will be the collectible coin, the power-up mushroom, the breakable crate, and of course the classic green pipe. We'll be drawing these items using the size of the tiles, just so we have some consistent numbers. Later on we may need to change the scale and make some last-minute adjustments when we put them in the final illustration. So let's start with arguably the easiest one, the classic green pipe. The shape of the pipe is super easy to make. Grab the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle of about 2 tiles by 2 tiles. And give it this green color that is roughly the same green that you see in the Mario games. Now to create the top part of the pipe, you could grab again the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle on top of the pipe, very carefully so it's in the exact center. But here it's easier to simply duplicate this rectangle with Ctrl D and then holding Ctrl so the movement is constrained to the vertical axis. Move it up and start scaling it into position holding Shift. This way you make sure this second rectangle is perfectly in the center. Just make it slightly lower than one tile and slightly wider than the other rectangle. But what makes this pipe object more interesting are the highlights and shadows. So let's start with the shadows. We want shadows on 2 places. First a drop shadow from the top part of the pipe and a side shadow. This is super easy to make. Just grab the pen tool and draw the drop shadow just below the top part. Remember that you can make this completely straight line if you hold Ctrl while you click to add a node, and then intersect it inside. And give it a shadow color with our color selection technique. Now do the same for the other side shadows. Try to make the shadows of roughly the same width. When you're done, intersect them inside and give it the same color than the other shadow. Now here's a really nice technique to copy the color from one object to another super fast. You copy the object from which you want to get the colors with Ctrl C, and then you select the object you want to paste the colors with the object tool and hit Ctrl Shift B. This will apply the colors of the copied object's fill and stroke, as well as any other style properties like stroke width and gradient, to the selected object. This way you don't have to be constantly switching to the object and dropper tool to apply a common color. This is the fastest way to apply color to the highlights and shadows, because most of the time they will have a common color that repeats. So from now on, if you see that an object gets colored out of nowhere, it's because I'm pasting the style using this shortcut. Great, now for the highlights. We want to make it look like this is a metal material, and to do that, we are gonna make the highlight in a specific way. But let's start with the rim highlight. This one is the same as with the shadow, just make a perfectly straight line shape, intersect it inside and give it a fairly bright highlight color. This highlight should be on top of the shadow, hiding part of it. For the other highlights, we're gonna separate it into 2 to give the impression of a more complex material. So using the same method of creating shapes with straight lines, make a thin and a wider rectangular shape right next to each other. Intersect them inside and copy the highlight color, hopefully using the paste style method. Now let's save us some work and copy these 2 shapes and move them into the upper part of the pipe, moving them a bit to the side. Again, intersect them inside and give it the highlight color. A little note, You could have used the rectangle tool to create these rectangular highlights and shadows, but I thought it would be nice to show you how to create these shapes quickly using the pen tool. Now it's all a matter of creating the darker outline. Just duplicate the two pipe shapes, make a union, and give it a darker green stroke with a nice and thick width. And of course, send it below. In a previous lesson I told you that sometimes it's good to create skewed and uneven shapes to avoid parallel lines. Well, in this case, because the shape of the asset is important to the gameplay, it's a good idea to keep the silhouette as it is, with boring parallel lines and all. And since the highlight and shadow define the shape of the object, it's also a good idea to make them fit this boring shape. Now let's make the collectible coin. Grab the ellipse tool, and using a tile as a guide, draw an ellipse slightly less wide than the tile. Give it a gold yellow. You can copy my numbers for the color if you want. Now let's make the side of the coin. Duplicate the highlight and give it this lower brightness and saturation yellow. I also moved the edge slider a bit to the left to make it just a pinch orange. This coin is meant to be a collectible item, so I think it warrants a bit more colorful color scheme. Now to add some interest, let's create a circular carved plane in the center of the coin. Duplicate the front plane, change its color so you can see what you're doing, and holding Ctrl and Shift so you keep the proportions and scale from the center. Scale in. How much it's up to you and the type of coin you're going for. As far as color, remember we want a bit more colorful item. So we are gonna do the same we did with the side plane, not only lowering the lightness, but also lowering the saturation a bit, and moving the hue slider a bit towards the orange. Let's add a shadow in the inner plane. You know the drill, duplicate twice and move the upper copy a good quantity so the shadow shape is clearly visible from far away. This time sample the color from the plane and lower even more the lightness, saturation and hue so you get this really strong orange color. Okay, now it's time to make the highlight opposite to the light source. One thing, we want this highlight to be nice and thick so it's visible from far away. Plus it's gold so it's supposed to be shiny. So we have to make the highlight on the outer side of the carved plane, rather than the way we've been doing it before, on the inside section of a carved surface. Well, in my opinion, the easiest way to do this is to use a variation of the difference technique. To do this, duplicate the plane twice and change the color like you would normally do. And move this shape slightly to the side. Then you send it below the other shape. And now that it's visible, adjust only the colored shape instead of the top shape. When you're done, perform the difference. So you can see that's pretty much the same process, but slightly different. As far as the color, give it an almost white yellow. This will look good because it's supposed to be gold, and gold looks good with big, shiny highlights. But I want to give it an extra highlight to make it look even more shiny. Grab the pen tool and make this long shape that covers the whole coin. And of course, intersect it inside the coin with the frontal plane, move it below the carved plane, and give it the highlight color. One last thing I want to do with this highlight, I want to make it more interesting. More like it shows a texture. So with the pen tool, Draw these blocks on top of the big highlight and perform a difference. And that's it for the coin. The last step, of course, it will be to create the outline. So select both the frontal and side ellipses, duplicate them, and perform a union. Give it a darker color with a nice and thick pixel width, and of course move it to the back. Regarding the colors technique we used, it's very common for artists to move slightly the saturation and hue slider when giving colors to shadows and highlights and different planes to create more colorful and interesting illustrations. I didn't talk about it until now because I thought that it wasn't necessary. But in this case of a collectible coin, we needed to make it as much colorful and contrasting as we could. So at the moment of picking colors, keep in mind that you are not bounded to only handle the L slider. Introducing other values, as long as you're subtle, will make your illustrations more colorful. Okay, let's continue with the items by making a crate. Don't worry, this one is easier than it looks. Grab the rectangle tool and create a rectangle the size of a tile. If you want, you can round it off just a bit, but not too much, just enough so the edges won't look that aggressive. And give it a mid-saturation brown color. Now we want to create the different planks. I want to do the same we did with the bricks in the bricks lesson, and make them slightly skewed to make them look more cartoony. The easiest way to do this is to use the pen tool and the intersection technique. Don't forget, you just want to give it a slight twist. Don't exaggerate. Give it a lighter version of the brown color. In this case, I also moved the hue and increased saturation just a bit to make the planks pop up a bit more. For the next step, it would be helpful to keep the outline, so don't remove them yet. We're gonna give the crate shadows from the planks, so we need a clear separation between planks to guide us. This will add a lot of depth and detail to the asset. So with the pen tool, draw a single shape that will go through the entire crate. So as you draw, keep in mind that the shadow will change in length depending on whether there is a plank below or not. So make the shadow longer or shorter depending on that. Since the shadows will go through different colored objects, remember, we'll need to use the low opacity black shadow method. So you know what to do. Give it a black color and lower the opacity. And send it below the top plank, but above all the other ones. For the left plank, you could create the shadow and then perform a union with the top shadow so they share the same color properties. There is also the diagonal plank. Also, don't forget the always useful paste style command with Ctrl-Shift-B, so you don't have to give the shadows color manually. Okay, now I want to add a small detail that's really gonna make a difference. I want to add this separation or indentation that these types of planks often have. For this, create a straight line with the pen tool. Remember that you can hold Ctrl while you place a point to make it perfectly horizontal. Give it a darker shade of brown than the planks. Now with the object tool, duplicate it and move it down so it's sharing a border with the other one. And give this copy a lighter shade of the brown of the planks. Select both shapes and group them. Now move this group to the center of each plank. As you place them, you'll need to rotate them in the same direction as the plank, and of course handle the right stack order. Don't worry about them sticking out, we'll fix that in a minute. Great, now it's time to remove the parts that are sticking out. We have two options, to use an intersection or to limit the visibility using clips. Previously I said that I always prefer to use intersections for simple cases, because they tend to prevent problems down the road with more complex illustrations. Well, in this particular case, since it's such a simple asset, it's easier to go in and use a clip instead of an intersection. The problem is that here an intersection would require to go in and dismantle every single group and also transform each of the strokes to paths before we could perform any Boolean operation. Just clip each of these groups with the mine box shape or with the planks, and it'll be super easy in this case. This back part of the crate also needs these lines to make it look like it's made of multiple other planks. So move a couple of copies down. You're probably gonna have to change the color so they better fit the darker color they are against. One tiny little detail. I want to create 4 nails on each corners to have some area of details in the borders. Since this is gonna be seen from far away, the nails are gonna be super simple. Just a perfect ellipse with a darker shade of grey. One last detail, grab the pen tool and draw this half moon shape. Make it a really light shade of grey to imply the intense highlight of metal. And now if you want, you can give it a quick shadow. Duplicate the circle, give it a full black and lower the opacity. And don't forget to move it a bit down. And duplicate it to the 4 corners. Let's create the highlight and shadows of the overall crate. This is what will make it look more three-dimensional. You know what to do. Create the highlight shape above using the pen tool. Again, be careful of the corners. Make sure to give it some roundness there so they fit the shape. The same with the shadow shape below. And don't forget this top plane that's pointing up in this plank. This plane also needs a highlight. Now give them the classic highlight and shadow colors. There is one last detail I want to add. I want to add some slight destruction or cuts here and there. to add more interest to the whole object. Don't worry, it won't be hard. We are just gonna use some unions and differences to add some spikes in a few places. First, let's start by making some planks more interesting. I want a couple of big cuts in the top and in the middle plank. So grab the pen tool and draw a spike. We're gonna do something similar to what we did with the brick block. Then select the spike and plank and perform a difference to carve that area. We also want to add some spikes in the highlights to imply some damage in the corner that's letting some light or shadow through. So repeat the same steps, draw a few spikes with the pen tool, only that this time we want to add the spike to the highlight or shadow, so use a union instead of a difference. Okay, for the finishing touches. After making some tests, I realized that I prefer to keep the outline of each plank, otherwise they kinda blend too much. There's not enough contrast. So instead of removing the stroke, just give it a darker brown than the other colors, maybe the same color than the outer outline. And as far as size, make the stroke size small. The goal of these outlines is to make the separation between planks more obvious, not to encapsulate the entire asset, so you want a small stroke size. And of course we want some large outline as well, so grab the main back shape, duplicate it, you can give it the same color as the plank outlines, and of course give it a nice thick pixel width. The grate is done. Now if you want you can make it fit a tile by using the same snapping method I showed you in the last lesson. Now let's make the mushroom power up. As always we are going to be using a single tile as a guide for the stroke sizes. Now this item is a bit different than the other ones. It's a bit more organic. This means that there is more room to play with the shape, moving and adjusting the nodes and getting the shape you want. So first, let's start by quickly creating the two main shapes of the mushroom, the stem and the cap. The idea here is to get the proportions right off the bat. After we have the proportions, we can go in and start adjusting the shapes of both. So grab the rectangle tool and create a rectangle that fits about this big in a tile. Notice a couple of things. First, that is in the center. Second, that it's really short and it doesn't even reach the half point of the tile. Now with the modifier, round it off a bit. For the cap, just make an ellipse that goes through the other shape as I'm showing you here. Now that we have the proportions, let's start modifying these shapes and giving them the final shape. Let's start with the cap. With the ellipse selected, go to Path, Object to Path, to get access to the nodes. Now since this is a more organic shape, copying exactly what I'm doing is gonna be a bit harder. Just try to place the nodes in the same place that I did, and go from there. So grab the two nodes at the sides and lower them. Grab the node at the bottom and move it a bit up. Then adjust the length of the handles of each node till you get a silhouette similar to mine. Finally, give it a nice saturated orange red as a fill and remove the stroke. For the stem, it's easy. Give it a reddish white color. Just sample the red color and lower the saturation and move the lightness up till it's almost white, but with a tint of red. To me, this color just looks more pleasant than a grayish white. It makes it feel more like a real mushroom. First, remove the top two nodes, so you get only two. And introduce this curvature to imply that the form is actually cylindrical. Adjust the proportions by moving, scaling, and rotating the stem shape if you need. Now let's add the details. For the cap, let's add the classic mushroom spots. This is super easy. Just pick the ellipse tool and draw 3 or 4 spots. I like to add one that's gonna be cut with an intersection, just to imply some volume. Chances are that you need to modify them or rotate them a bit. To modify the spots, remember that you could use Path Object to Path to transform the spot into a path, or the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-C. For the stem, I want to add a couple of beady eyes. With the ellipse tool, create one elongated ellipse. Give it a dark gray color, not quite full black, but close. Now create a smaller, more circular ellipse and give it a whitish color. Again, not quite full white, but close. And put it on the left side of the black eye. Duplicate the eye to the side, and since we want it to be in a sort of 3/4 view, offset a bit the two eyes to the side, so it appears like it's looking to the side. And now the shadows. This is quite simple. We want to imply that this cap has a lower plane. So with the pen tool, draw all around it defining this lower plane. When you're done, adjust the nodes. You also want a shadow on the right side to be consistent with the rest of the assets. Just draw it, intersect it inside, and join it with the other shadow by performing a union. Notice that the shadow is overlapping one of the spots, so we're gonna have to use a black color with a lower opacity as a shadow color. For the shadow in the stem, don't forget the drop shadow from the mushroom cap, and the right side. When you're done, intersect it inside and give it the same shadow color than the cap. Of course, the last step is gonna be to create the outline of the two main shapes, the stem and cap. So you know the drill. Create a red and thick outline using a duplicate of the main cap shape and send it to the bottom. For the stem, because the stem is in front of the cap, you want the outline to be behind all shapes of the stem, but in front of all shapes of the cap. And we are done with the items. Remember that because these items will have a different function than the other assets, we may need to make some quick adjustments at the moment of putting them in the final illustration. It's gonna be mostly a few quick changes in scale or width size, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.